Excellent. All right. Hello, and thank you. I have returned. Before I go much further, it's called queer horror. There's a reason why it's called queer horror. Before I go much further, though, I know that there are some people who have difficulty with the word queer as a catch-all term for people who are not heterosexual and not cisgender. I personally am drawn to it for its relative simplicity, its embrace of the spectrum of non-cishet identities, and its activist tone. I know it doesn't have the same resonance for everyone, though, so I appreciate your patience as I use it relentlessly. Um, I would also like to acknowledge what a terrible time it is for trans and non-binary people here and around the world. All genres of writing benefit from trans and non-binary voices and perspectives, and that very much includes horror. You are absolutely welcome here, and I hope you find something useful and encouraging in what I have to say. Finally, I am donating a portion of my fees for this presentation to baytumal.org. They provide humanitarian aid to underserved populations around the world, including Palestine. I will provide a link for them and actually a bunch of other stuff at the end of this session. So, as you may have guessed, I'm David Demchuk. I'm the author of two novels, The Bone Mother and Red X, and the co-author of a third, The Butcher's Daughter, which will be out in May. Um, all three books fall into the category of queer horror, and that includes The Butcher's Daughter, which it reveals the untold story of Mrs. Lovett, notorious pie-baking helpmate to the murderous Barbara Sweeney Todd. Um, so that means, yes, we have queered up Mrs. Lovett. Something for all of you to look forward to, though what that looks like and how that comes about, I'm not currently at liberty to say. Um, some of you will remember the recent discussion of Red X at the Romancing the Gothic book group. Red X is about a series of disappearances from Toronto's gay community over a 40-year period, which actually turns out to be over 200 years, and the efforts of surviving friends and family to find out who or what is responsible, emphasis on the what. Interwoven is my own story as a horror writer, as a gay man, and as someone whose fiction is breaching the boundaries of fiction, whose novel is breaching the boundaries of fiction and entering his own life. One of the things that fascinated me as we launched and promoted Red X was the realization by some people that it was a queer horror novel. Many of the people who I spoke to at the time had never encountered such a thing, and many of them couldn't imagine why I would write it or why they should read it. My husband told me he'd never read a book before that only had queer people in it. I corrected him and said there were plenty of straight people in the book, but they were not main characters, and the story was not told from their perspective. That's what he'd never experienced. Horror is a much maligned genre, but it is the fifth most popular genre in publishing today, and perennially popular in film, television, video games, and occasionally in audio and on the stage. Horror elements have found their way into many other genres, darkening and I would say deepening them. But before we go too much further, we should possibly talk about what horror actually is. By most definitions, horror consists largely of works that horrify, terrify, repulse, or unsettle. Horror is as old as storytelling itself, and in recent centuries is threaded through Jacobean drama, Gothic fiction, sensation novels, and Grand Guignol. As a genre, it is defined by the feelings it provokes in its audience and by the tropes, tools, and techniques it uses to achieve those emotions. Horror stories can be shocking, grisly, gory, vicious, or they can be disquieting, unnerving, creepy, uncanny. They can give a feeling of profound unease. They can be intense, suffused with dread. They can be wildly suspenseful, or melancholy, or darkly funny. Horror is a tremendously elastic genre, able to contain and convey a wide range of experiences, perspectives, and narrative approaches. Emily Hughes, an editor at Tor.com, has said that horror is a lens. You hold it up to a story, any kind of story, and by using this lens, you can see it and create it in a different way. There is a robust debate about whether horror stories must contain a supernatural or speculative element, but there are certain violent suspense thrillers and black comedies that we categorize as horror, and we even lend the term to some works of nonfiction. Also, at least these days, horror stories rarely have unambiguously happy endings. Horror uses a wide array of archetypes, themes, and tropes as a way to explore our deepest fears, often to our great discomfort. Let's take a moment to look at those because they're going to come up again and again. Age, disease, decay, disability, physical pain, injury, torture, sex, intimacy, vulnerability, loneliness, alienation, isolation, captivity, loss of control, loss of status, incomprehension, confusion, disconnection, disorientation, inscrutability, difference, which is a huge thing in horror, difference in age, in race, in gender, in appearance, sexual orientation, class, beliefs, ability, and of course, death and not death. We can divide these fears into roughly three categories: the individual, the very specific things that frighten you because of your past experiences or your personal associations; the collective, fears that you share with your family, your community, your region, your subculture; and the universal, fears that we all share, that are hard coded into us over generations, consciously or subconsciously, across cultures and regions and identities at the deepest part of our human psychological makeup. Queer people have not fared well in literature over the centuries, and particularly not in the genres that we now call horror. Traditional roles for queer people have generally included victim, villain, comic relief, sidekick, or a member of the ensemble, what used to be called local color. Until quite recently, the queer character was rarely a romantic lead, or a champion, or a character with agency and purpose. In mysteries, thrillers, and horror, queer characters seldom took the lead unless they were significantly desexualized or their sexuality was a source of danger and was punished in some way, often motivating revenge. As we will see, the depiction of queer people in horror has evolved over decades and centuries, and horror readers have learned a great deal about queer people by confronting and interrogating their fears about us and by experiencing our fears as we have expressed them. So, first, something that will help us along as we talk. This is a theory about the fundamentals of storytelling. There are three components: there's the teller, who could be the author but could also be a presenter. There's the story itself, which is the narratives, characters, the themes, the language, the semiotics. And then there's the audience, who receives the story and completes it within their imagination. A story is a communication process. A story is not complete without all three of these elements. A book on a shelf is not a complete story. It's just an object until someone reads it and experiences it. With that in mind, let's look at some fundamentals of queer storytelling. Queer identified author or presenter, story with queer content, narrative, characters, themes, language, semiotics, perceived as queer by a queer audience. A story can be understood to be queer with even just one of these elements. So here is what the queer community looked like when I came out in 1978. That's me there on the lower left, the balding theater gay. Um, I have something I'd like to read. It's a selection, don't be horrified by this horror suggestion, a selection from a master's thesis by Dudrick Bevans. Its focus is on transcoded monsters, but I think that much of this applies across the queer spectrum. A monster, a creature or person whose presence frightens and conjures an anxiety of the destruction of physical or social order, is never simply an embodiment of fear. Rather, a monster is a lesson about fear, how to fight that fear, avoid that fear, and most importantly, the pleasure to be found in the source of the fear and the fight against the fear the monster represents. The monster, from conception to depiction, from consumption to response, is twofold. First, a complex system of social control, and second, a pedagogy or method of instruction. The monster serves as a functionary of social control on two levels. First, the societal level, in which the monster as a product of society teaches what is and is not permissible in that society. The second level is the personal level, in which the monster teaches the audience about the boundaries of their own desire and that desire's possibility. The product of these two levels' methods of control is a pedagogy of tense familiarity, wherein an uncomfortable identification with the monster arises and through which the very nature of the monster changes. The monster's act of teaching social order in turn reveals a positive, albeit hidden curriculum, where the audience learns about itself, its existence, and its experience. This accident of monster methodology renders the monster sympathetic, normalized, via the loss of mystery surrounding its depiction and the repetition of its own image. Thus, the monster is a self-defeating tool, even when resurrected. In short, the pedagogy of monsters is like many others. When implemented correctly, it renders itself useless to subjects who have completely learned its structures. The audience graduates from their fear rather than being controlled by it. So let's get back to those characteristics I've listed that can help us identify whether or not a work of horror could be identified as queer or described as queer. These are especially helpful as we look back at horror written prior to the year 2000, back into the 1970s and 80s, and then beyond into the 19th century. Very often, but not always, a work of horror may be identified as queer through the identity of the authors or creators. If you know or learn that a horror author is queer, it can be rewarding to survey their work to see if any of the previously mentioned elements are present. Likewise, if a work can be interpreted as queer, it can be interesting to see if an author has other work that can be read this way, and if any of it shines a light on their personal situation. Of course, the farther back we go in time, the more complicated it can be to try to determine an author's gender or sexuality. Some of them went to a great deal of trouble to conceal it, given the punishments they would have faced. If the possibility is there, it's worth exploring. But not every queer work has a queer author, and not every queer author is invested in creating queer work. Apart from the author, a work of horror may have an interpreter that imbues the work with queerness. In an adaptation, this can mean a screenwriter or a playwright, a director, a translator. Ken Russell, for example, was a notoriously straight director, but he had an exceptionally camp sensibility and cranked up the queer factor in a number of his films, notably Gothic, The Lair of the White Worm, and The Devils. A work can also have a queer presenter, a reader, a narrator, a performer, whose presence can hint at aspects of queerness in an otherwise conventional work. Gay director James Whale frequently worked with queer actors such as Boris Karloff, Elsa Lanchester, Ernest Thesiger, and Charles Laughton, and they contributed to an atmosphere of queerness in works like Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein and The Old Dark House. A work of queer horror might be identified because of its queer associated setting or milieu. Greenwich Village in the 1950s, Fire Island in the 1970s, Castro Street in San Francisco, Soho in London, or on a smaller scale, a haute couture fashion house, backstage at a Broadway musical, a bohemian artist colony. Or we could take a look at its secondary or background characters, the oddly intimate troupe of dancers and their petulant choreographer, the inmates of a women's prison and their imperious matron, the acolytes of a satanic cult and their archly commanding high priest or priestess. A work may feature some queer identified themes or topics, creating or nurturing life outside the family unit, changing or trading identities to escape a restrictive past, working or living alongside other members of the same gender and developing volatile situational bonds, suffering an intimate violation that transforms one from a figure of virtue into a predator or a monster. A work may include some queer signifiers and touchstones. A young man may be quiet, sensitive, artistic, a confirmed bachelor, a sensualist, a night owl, a loner, a mama's boy, with a fascination for classical music or the opera. A young woman might be headstrong, mannish, a career girl, sporty, bookish, or icy. He may wear flowing shirts and colorful scarves or turtlenecks with chains over them. She might wear a velvet choker, prim masculine suits, or black lingerie. Symbols of queerness can include mirrors, masks, feathers, figurines, self portraits, and lots of nudes. A work may include tropes or other narrative elements often found in queer fiction in general and horror in particular. Twins and doubles, assumed and discarded identities, dual narratives, circular narratives, framing devices and nested narratives, mazes, traps, and cages, false deaths, false births, false starts, disguises and reveals, found families, created children, and of course, suppressed or unexpressed desires that threaten to explode. Finally, as we move closer to the present day, queer characters begin to take center stage. At last, a work of queer horror may have a queer antagonist, or it may have a queer protagonist, and from time to time, it may have both. A work of queer horror may include queer relationships. I know, right? But how often have we seen queer work that includes a single queer character in an otherwise straight environment? The sidekick, the fifth wheel. So, yes, queer relationships, sexual and non sexual, of varying lengths and strengths, that may or may not involve the antagonist or protagonist, that may or may not end well. So, here's a tricky thing. A work of horror may be identified as queer because that's how a queer audience perceives it, either through their interpretation of it, which may change over time, sometimes over decades, or through their imposition of queerness upon it against all evidence, or because something in it strikes a unique chord among queer people, one that most other audiences wouldn't detect. For example, let's look at a few David Cronenberg movies. David Cronenberg also is by all accounts straight, but we can identify some of his movies as queer or having undercurrents of queerness and transness because they deal directly with material that we as queer and trans people recognize and relate to. Shivers, Rabid, Videodrome, Dead Ringers, The Fly all have very strong queer or trans imagery. The two women in the pool in Shivers passing the organism with a kiss up one throat and down the other. Marilyn Chambers and Rabid with the phallic blood-sucking proboscis in her armpit. James Woods in Videodrome with the handy vaginal slit in his abdomen. Jeremy Irons is the unnaturally close twin brothers in Dead Ringers, sharing a sexual relationship with and through Genevieve Bujold. Jennifer Goldblum in The Fly, emerging from the pod into a new kind of adolescence as his body begins to transform and he develops a new and powerful identity. Oh, and his penis drops off. Or another favorite monster, the Babadook, adopted as a queer icon because Netflix misidentified the film as an LGBTQ movie, and some very online queer people ran with it and started making memes. However, journalist John Paul Brammer said at the time, haunting a small white family in an Australian suburb is a radical act. I count myself among the most vocal supporters of the movement to recognize the Babadook as a radical representation of queerness. Of course, a work of horror may also be identified as queer if it devises, depicts, and embodies queer fears. Fears that straight people have of queer people, or fears that queer people have and that are, if not unique, then pronounced within our communities. We as queer people have been afraid of many things over the centuries, and rightly so. Violence, physical, social, psychological, sexual or social manipulation, forced conformity, disease and decay, generational trauma, institutional oppression, the monsters among us in our community, in our family, at our workplace. But loneliness, isolation is another powerful one, family abandonment, violation of trust, forced assimilation, loss of community, loss of expression, monsters within us, within our bodies, within our minds, losing oneself or becoming another, or sometimes both. As we look at a selection of works of queer horror, we'll see more and more of our queer fears represented alongside the fears that straight people have about us. So here's a bookshelf. Um, we have a selection of novels here published between about 1850 and 1975. Now, this is by no means exhaustive. I am not going to say that these are the only queer horror novels published during that period. I could have added Dracula, Frankenstein, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and a few others which are heavily queer coded, but this gives a bit of a flavor of what was around. Let's start with our two sensation novels, The Woman in White and Lady Audley's Secret, both of which have queerish characters stepping out of their expected gender roles and their romantic pursuits. In The Woman in White, we have two half sisters who are very close, one of whom has a somewhat startling masculine appearance and a take charge attitude. She takes a dominant role in the narrative on a number of fronts in an overt rejection of the womanly weakness and helplessness that we see in our other female characters of that era. In Lady Audley's Secret, Robert Audley and his childhood friend George develop an unusually close friendship after George's wife dies. After George vanishes, Robert is left to solve his disappearance and the mystery alluded to in the title. Oh, I can tell you that Lady Audley's Secret is not that she's George. Um, Next, we have three Gothic classics: the surprisingly explicit lesbian vampire novella Carmilla, predating Dracula by 25 years; The Picture of Dorian Gray, which led to Oscar Wilde's prosecution on indecency charges; and the Henry James story The Turn of the Screw, which hints at a troubling and violent relationship between a valet and governess, now both dead, with their spirits acting supernaturally through two children, a brother and sister. In 13 Women, we have a pulpy proto-slasher. The titular clique, horribly mistreated a mixed-race schoolmate when they were children. Now she is sending them horoscopes predicting their gruesome deaths, and that includes a crudely but somewhat sympathetically portrayed butch femme couple named Hazel and Martha. J.B. Priestley's comic novel Benighted was adapted into the play The Old Dark House, subsequently filmed by queer director James Whale. Subverting tropes even as it was creating them, the novel tells of a trio of weather-stranded tourists who are forced to stop in at the house of the Femme family, where sexual, social, and familial tensions abound. Next, we have a pair of modern ghost stories. In The Uninvited, we have not one but two ghosts, and one of them is so heavily lesbian coded she might as well arrive in a Subaru. Meanwhile, The Haunting of Hill House daringly has a lesbian psychic investigator, Theo, who is actually quite normal, and to everyone's delight, survives her stay at the titular house. Not so our protagonist, Eleanor, who seems to be in the throes of homosexual panic when she meets her untimely end. Psycho, well, what can you say? In Cold Blood, Truman Capote's problematic nonfiction novel, centers on two homosexually partnered thrill killers who murder a family in rural Kansas. Cruising, written by a straight man and none too flatteringly, focuses on a straight cop who may or may not undergo a conversion on several fronts when he investigates a number of gruesome murders, inspired by true events, in New York's leather community. The other was a turning point for popular horror, with a queer author, Thomas Tryon, telling the story of twin boys, one good, one evil, both different from their family and peers, who are encouraged by their aunt to explore their talent for psychic connection, which has a deep kinship with acting, performing, passing, switching, and holding multiple identities. The children also have a fascination with and an alienation from heteronormative family, sexuality, and reproduction, which leads to a grotesque finale. And then finally, from a queer publisher, we see The Slasher by pseudonymous author Sebastian Lamb. I'm so glad I could say that. Two somewhat closeted detectives search for a psychopathic gay killer targeting other men, in some ways foreshadowing the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. So, what are the fears in these books? On those shelves, the majority of fears being expressed and explored are those of straight people. Not a big surprise, including the majority of the readership at the time, confronted with queer characters and queer situations. Yet they still provide insights into queer life and relationships in their various eras, and the level of acceptance that some experienced among family members, friends, and communities. Let's see what kind of frightening topics and themes are represented here. Deviancy, is a big one, and it's expressed in numerous ways. Um, there are secret or misaligned identities. There are unnatural passions. There is sexual repression and obsession. There are deals with the devil to varying degrees. There's child predation. There's sexual precociousness. There's sexual or social manipulation. Another big fear during this time period is class or race or familial erosion, the breaking down of the barriers. Um, we see blackmail or betrayal. We see family abandonment. We see revenge for mistreatment. We see disease and decay, tainted bloodlines, violent desires, and inherited or marital madness. So let's take a moment to talk about an interesting subgenre that arose in the 1940s and persisted through the 60s. It's very specific. Modern day witches, living in secret, often as part of a family or coven, and the power they wield over the unsuspecting men in their lives, very often their husbands or their husbands to be. Now, only one of these is an outright horror movie, the deadly serious and very effective film Night of the Eagle, also known as Burn Witch Burn. It's on the upper right. It is about an ambitious young academic who is rapidly ascending among the faculty at his university. He discovers that his wife is a witch, and she claims it is because of her efforts that he is achieving success. When he destroys the talismans that are protecting their household, they are beset by sudden, shocking misfortunes which appear to be the work of a rival witch somewhere at the school. This is one of several adaptations of Fritz Lieber's book Conjure Wife. While not inherently queer, the script for the film was written by Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson and notable queer horror screenwriter George Baxt. It is an interesting representation of this theme, and the rivalry between the two witches has an intriguing edge as they each work outside the patriarchy to advance their respective husbands' careers. I Married a Witch, the other black and white film, is a 1942 romantic comedy starring Veronica Lake as a witch burned at the stake in Salem who escapes her imprisonment in a cursed tree and regains her human form, at first to torment the descendant of her executioner, but then eventually to fall in love with him and marry him. This is a darker film than one might expect, with an interesting political subtext for the period, but it still keeps things lively and sassy and a little bit campy. It has a certain kinship with the next film, Bell, Book and Candle, which is on the upper left. This is another lively comedy starring Kim Novak as Jillian, a modern day witch living in New York's Greenwich Village in the late 1950s, who casts a love spell on the fiance of her old college rival and struggles with the consequences. Greenwich Village was widely known as a center for the bohemian lifestyle from near the end of World War II through to the 1970s and 80s, and its appearance in books and films is often a secret signal to a queer audience. Based on a play by gay playwright John Van Druten, a significant part of the film focuses on the witch's role as an outsider and the belonging she feels among her queer-coded family and friends in their sizable community of witches and warlocks, who all live in close proximity to each other and go to hidden private clubs where they can socialize undisturbed. Both Bell, Book and Candle and I Married a Witch inspired the creation of one of television's most successful sitcoms. Bewitched, of course, was about a witch who marries a mortal man, much to the disdain of her mother Andorra and amusement of her eccentric family members. Her father Maurice, her twin sister Sabrina, her acidic uncle Arthur, her daffy Aunt Clara, all of whom use magic behind the backs of mortals for their convenience. Several of the cast members were queer, not least the wildly campy Paul Lynde, who was as visibly gay as anyone could possibly be, and numerous storylines focused on how important it was for the witches to hide themselves because of society's lack of acceptance. I would be remiss if I did not introduce you to one of my favorite Satanists, Jacqueline Gibson, played by Jean Brooks in the 1943 film The Seventh Victim. In this film, young Mary Gibson, played by Kim Hunter, leaves school to search for her missing sister Jacqueline and uncovers a very obviously satanic cult in, guess where? New York's Greenwich Village. Apparently, the neighborhood was overrun and finds that they may have something to do with her siblings' disappearance. In fact, the very obviously queer satanic cult is angry that Jacqueline exposed their secrets to her psychiatrist and now plans to psychologically torture her into killing herself. Not only is the satanic cult queer coded, but Jacqueline has very obviously been involved with one of the other cult members, a young woman named Frances, who at a critical moment slaps the cup of poison out of Jacqueline's hand and rather shockingly cries, I can't let you die. The only time I was ever happy was when I was with you. So here we have a selection of horror novels, somewhat larger selection, published between 1975 and 1999. I will describe each of them briefly, but overall, I can say that we have more unambiguously gay and lesbian writers, one of whom will subsequently reveal themselves to be trans, more portrayals of queer relationships, and some positively, if tragically rendered, queer protagonists. We also reach a major turning point with the debut of Clive Barker. So Gothic horror, I mean Gothic in general, but Gothic horror was back in a big way in the 1970s. Let's start with Clara Reeve, a bonkers Gothic extravaganza written by Leonie Hargrave, who is actually gay male science fiction writer Thomas Dish. This is an interesting example of a queer writer who not only wrote under a pseudonym, but adopted a different gender in doing so. In this case, it was so that he could distinguish this book from his other genre work, and also to create a level of comfort with a readership largely composed of women. But it was not unusual for queer literary writers to adopt pseudonyms to write work in other genres, including romance, horror, mysteries, and porn. In the second row on the far left, we have The Elementals by Michael McDowell, a prolific gay writer who brought us Beetlejuice, among other things. This book has a very subtly drawn gay character, but the line of mysteries he wrote in the 1980s with Dennis Schuetz under the name Nathan Aldine features a duo of detectives, one of whom is a very out gay man. Interview with a Vampire needs no introduction, but it is notable here as one of several novels written by a straight author, albeit one who wrote erotica under a pseudonym that included sexual activity across genders and who described herself as having a gay sensibility. While her vampires were innately tragic and frequently problematic, their found family was recognizable and sympathetic beyond the queer communities. Other straight authors on these shelves include Jeffrey Convitz, Anne Rivers Siddons, and Peter Straub. John Saul's supernatural thriller, Suffer the Children, was a milestone in paperback horror. It was the first paperback original to reach the New York Times bestseller list and the first paperback original to have television advertising. It is not often mentioned, but John Saul is gay and lives with his partner of almost 50 years, who has collaborated on several of his novels. Very few of his books include gay characters or references, but his effect on the mainstreaming of the horror genre over the last half century is certainly notable. The success of Suffer the Children helped create a boom in mass market paperback horror, and the results are now well known and remembered thanks to Grady Hendrix's book, Paperbacks from Hell. We have several so-called paperbacks from hell on this list, starting with the Sentinel. If you don't know, and I can't imagine how it's possible, it's about a young model who moves into a Brooklyn brownstone built over the gates of hell, and she is in line to become its next guardian, whether she likes it or not. The building, of course, is infected by demons, and they are manifested through some of the most obnoxious but entertaining queer villain archetypes of the time, including a pair of leering lesbian lovers and a nosy old theater actor who turns out to be the devil. If you've not seen the film, I can only say it is like the love child of John Waters and Ryan Murphy, and you should prepare to be offended. Convitz wrote an even more offensive sequel called The Guardian, with a plot that revolved around whether the young mother in a particular household was actually trans. Next, that we have The Fan. Bob Randall, a gay writer who probably should have known better, I hope he got paid, gave us a distressing gay villain in The Fan, a clever and compulsively readable epistolary thriller about a young man obsessed with a Broadway legend who at first he fawns over, then stalks and menaces, and then finally terrorizes. It was not a flattering portrait, but even now it has a certain chilling relevance. The House Next Door by Southern author Anne Rivers Siddons is about a newly built house in a lovely neighborhood which has something distinctly wrong with it, though you'd be hard-pressed to say exactly what. One of the ill-fated couples who moves in is gay, and they are quite sympathetically portrayed for the time, even if they come to an unfortunate end. Burning by Jane Chambers is a rare lesbian-centered 1970s horror novel. Jane Chambers was a pioneering lesbian playwright and poet. This book focuses on two women possessed by unfulfilled lovers from 3 centuries prior, outcasts who were burned as witches. The Lure by gay author Felice Picano was in its own way a gay twin to the novel Cruising. It too is about a man, this time a sociology professor, who goes undercover into New York's 1970s gay community to try to solve a series of murders, and our protagonist also comes to some realizations about his sexuality as part of his journey. Unlike its straight authored counterpart, it is a genuine window into the gay community in that era, and mercifully, it is markedly less homophobic. We also have some other queer-inflected vampire novels that came out in the wake of Interview with the Vampire. The Delicate Dependency by gay author Michael Talbot, The Gilda Stories by lesbian author Jewel Gomez, and Out for Blood by gay author John Peyton Cook. All three are classics in their own right and are worth revisiting today. Talbot's novel is set in the Victorian era, where a physician's daughter is abducted by age-old vampires for their own dark purpose. The Gilda story is about an escaped slave in the 1850s who takes on the love and power of a vampire named Gilda, who is ready to surrender her earthly existence. And Out for Blood is about a young small-town gay man who is offered the chance to become a vampire after he is diagnosed with leukemia. It is hard to describe the impact that Clive Barker's books of blood had on readers and writers alike when they were first released. Even now, they are probably his towering achievement, capturing an incredible range of characters, scenarios, modes, and approaches to horror. Graphically violent, artfully written, with a matter-of-fact approach to sex, kink, and queerness that still startles. Another straight horror legend, Peter Straub, brought us a compelling major gay character named Tim Underhill in the post-Vietnam horror thriller Coco, and then brought him back again in 3 subsequent novels. At first suspected to be a serial killer by the other soldiers who served with him years before, he redeems himself and joins the search for the actual killer. He is a relatively rare positive portrayal of a gay man during this period, a real milestone in queer horror. Another gay horror writer who has been quite circumspect about it in his work is Douglas Clegg. Here we have Goat Dance, one of his early novels, with elements of Robert McCammon and Stephen King. A small Virginia town is overrun with horrors when a child comes back possessed after drowning in a nearby lake. Finally, we have Exquisite Corpse, an exceptionally gruesome serial killer novel that heralds the arrival of splatterpunk as a genre. Author Billy Martin, writing at the time as Poppy Z. Bright, was part of a wave of authors who took graphic physical violence to a new degree of explicitness and experimented with form and voice in unusual and disturbing ways. So here are some of the fears that we see explored on those shelves, fears that straight people have of us, but also, as we move out from the shadows into more significant roles as characters and authors, fears that we have as queer people, fears that are relevant to us and in some cases unique to us. Our terrible pasts, childhood and family abuse, generational trauma, failure of faith, colonial or military atrocities, child immorality, and inscrutability to a certain extent, losing oneself, becoming another, institutional oppression, monsters among us, which is, I'll remind you, monsters in our community, in our family, our workplace, in in our social circle, small town terrors, big city terrors, disease and decay, assimilation, anonymity, and how that does or does not pay off for you, parasocial toxicity, sexual adventurism and the anxieties around that, and trust and vulnerability. Let's take a quick look at adaptations and how they sometimes add or reduce queerness beyond the source material. Hellraiser, which Clive Barker adapted and directed from his novella The Hellbound Heart, is quite a heterosexual film on the surface, but the extremes of fetishism and kink were recognizable to anyone entering a leather and latex bar at the time, and their aesthetics and activities are as eerily enticing as they are unsettling. The film version of Carrie from the Stephen King novel. Straight novelist, straight director, straight writer, straight lead actress. The film leans in on Carrie's mistreatment and ostracization as a misfit and her desire to be accepted. The moment of self discovery when she looks up what she is in a dictionary was highly recognizable to queer audiences at the time. The Thing. This adaptation returns to the contagion aspect present in the original published story. Straight author, straight screenwriter, though the son of closeted gay actor Burt Lancaster. Straight cast. 12 men panic when something among them that looks just like one of them wants to penetrate them and convert them into something that looks like them but is not them. The original was about communism, like so many horror stories of its era. What's this one about? And then we have our problematic fave, Silence of the Lambs, straight novelist, straight director, straight writer. But even though she was not out, Jodie Foster's inherent queerness, reinforced by certain choices in the script and direction, gave us a queer heroine belittled, underestimated, and at times abused by the straight men around her. And of course, we have straight actor Ted Levine as Buffalo Bill, who, like Norman Bates, is absolutely not trans and absolutely not gay, just extremely disturbed. Okay, we could be here all day. These shelves are just a fraction of the queer horror published between the year 2000 and today. Most of them, I would say, are in the past 10 years or so. I'm not going to describe every single book here, but overall, I can say many more queer writers. In fact, no straight writers on these shelves at all. More women writers, more trans and non-binary writers, more bisexual writers, at least one ace arrow writer, more non-white writers, including Black, Latinx, Asian, South Asian, Caribbean, and Indigenous writers, and a range of publishers from small indies right up to the big five. We're also seeing more queering of history and folklore here, more about the lasting scars from family abuse, more internalizing of monstrosity, more overtly socio-political horror, apocalyptic horror, eco-horror, horror set in religious and conversion camps, more horror dealing with trans characters and gender anxieties. I will be sharing a document with the full list of books covered in this presentation, as well as the master's thesis I mentioned earlier, and also a bonus article on queerness in science fiction, fantasy, and horror by Steve Hugh Westenra. I'm never going to pronounce that right. Westenra. So there we go. Um, However, I can tell you this. Here are some of the queer fears that are touched on in the books on those shelves. Our terrible futures, our progress eroding, disease and decay, social collapse, nature fighting back, the monsters within us, once again, maybe always, the end of art, the rise of fascism, state and institutional violence, religious hypocrisy, stolen identities, forced conformism, the feeling that nowhere is safe, and the end of empathy, but not the end of queerness. So horror has traditionally been a small c conservative genre, very white, very straight, very male, a genre based in fear of the unknown, in rejecting difference instead of embracing it. We've seen a lot of misogyny, homophobia, racism, classism, ageism, religious and cultural prejudice, prejudice towards people with disabilities and different appearances. What does this mean? Who has been writing fiction and horror in particular? Who has the audience been for fiction and for horror in particular? When we read fiction or watch films or television or the performing arts, we are looking for ourselves. And if we don't see ourselves, we can feel disconnected. We as queer people don't necessarily need to be likable or even the center of the narrative. For many of us, just being present, being seen would be a positive change. We have long been told that white, attractive suburban straight couples and families are neutral and that everything else is, at best, marginalized. This has begun to change over the last 50 or 60 years, relatively recent when you consider the whole history of horror as a genre. Some of the very best modern horror has turned the tables and has sought to tell these stories from other perspectives. As that changes, the audience changes and grows, and that encourages a broader range of writers and readers. We can use horror as a personal form to question what we are told is frightening. We can interrogate the tropes and conventions, the structures. We can cast aside old, irrelevant, generic fears and talk about what scares us today, now, here in this world. By voicing our fears and sharing our stories, we can find a way forward together. This is by no means an exclusive list, but here are 4 recent films that I think offer an exciting and unconventional future for queer horror. I saw the TV Glow, the upper left. Jane Schoenbrun's unsettling film about 2 teenagers who become obsessed with a strange late night TV show that reveals a supernatural world beneath their own. Cuckoo, which stars Hunter Schafer in her film debut as a sullen teenager visiting a clinic in the Swiss Alps for reasons that become increasingly sinister. The Outwaters by queer writer director Robbie Banfitch, who also stars as one of the 4 friends who go into the Mojave Desert to shoot a music video and start to experience mysterious sounds, vibrations, hallucinations, and unexplained animal behavior before all hell breaks loose. And then Skinamarink, made by queer Canadian director Kyle Edward Ball. 2 small children wake up in their house to find that their father is missing and all the doors and windows have vanished. Then something starts telling them to do things. At last, at long last, we are now at questions. And I'm only going to just take a moment to try to do this correctly, to copy and then to go to the chat, which I, of course, have been ignoring, and paste in the chat the document that has the list. Yes, Skinamarink. I know that's not really a question for me at least, but it could be. There you go. That's how you spell it.